On the morning of September 18th, 1979, a battered red mailbox leaned toward a gravel road in Adair County, Iowa, while 63 wild boars burst through a broken fence and disappeared into 80 acres of ripening corn. The sound wasn't like cattle. It wasn't even like hogs escaping a pen. It was a low, rolling thunder mixed with snapping stalks and frantic squeals that carried across the valley before sunrise. By the time Evelyn Harper, 71 years old, reached the north pasture in her worn leather boots, the damage had already begun. She didn't run. She never had. She rested one weather hand on the fence post, watched the animals disappear into the rows, and quietly counted them. 63, she whispered. Across the road, a brand-new pickup truck sat beside a freshly painted white fence. Its owner, Daniel Mercer, leaned against the hood with folded arms. At 38, he had become one of the fastest-growing landowners in the county, buying neighboring farms with profits from modern confinement barns and aggressive grain contracts. His machinery gleamed. His buildings smelled of fresh lumber. His confidence filled every room before he entered it. When he saw Evelyn looking across the field, he smiled. Not kindly. The smile of a man who believed the story had already ended. Let me tell you about Evelyn Harper. She had lived on those 240 acres since the spring of 1936, when her father hitched 2 draft horses to a wagon and brought the family from Warren County after losing nearly everything during the hardest years of the Depression. The farmhouse wasn't much then. 2 bedrooms, a leaking roof, a hand pump that froze every January. But the soil was rich, black, and patient. Her father used to say the land remembered every honest hand that touched it. When he died in 1968, Evelyn inherited something many people thought was more burden than blessing: an aging farm, old fences, older machinery, and one machine she refused to sell, a 1952 John Deere Model 60, producing just over 40 horsepower, purchased new by her late husband, Thomas, for $2,650 from a dealership in nearby Greenfield. Every winter, Thomas changed the oil himself, cleaned the carburetor by hand, and covered the tractor with heavy canvas before the first snow. Even after cancer took him in 1971, Evelyn followed the same routine. The paint had faded. The seat was cracked. But every spring, the old 2-cylinder engine answered with the same deep, unmistakable rhythm. Pop, 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 around the county. People joked they could identify that tractor without looking. It sounded like home. Daniel Mercer never understood that. He believed efficiency mattered more than memory. His operation stretched across nearly 1,200 acres, worked by modern diesel tractors with enclosed cabs, radios, and enough horsepower to make Evelyn's old machine seem like a museum exhibit. To Daniel, sentiment had no place on a balance sheet. That tractor belongs in a parade, he once told a seed salesman, not in a field. People laughed. Evelyn never heard about it. Or maybe she did. It never changed how she worked. She planted slowly. She repaired instead of replacing. She knew which corners of every field held moisture longest after a dry July, and which hills dried first in August. She could tell rain was coming by the smell drifting through the cottonwoods along Middle River. Those weren't things learned from manuals. They were earned. The trouble between Daniel and Evelyn hadn't started with the Boars. It began 2 years earlier when Daniel offered to buy her farm. He named a figure that made neighbors whistle, nearly $430,000. For many people, that would have been the easiest decision of their lives. Evelyn thanked him, then said no, not because the money wasn't tempting, because some things couldn't be measured in dollars. Daniel couldn't understand that answer. He tried again 6 months later. Again, she declined. Then survey stakes appeared suspiciously close to her property line. Contractors widened drainage ditches. Heavy equipment worked later into the evenings. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just enough inconvenience that several neighbors quietly wondered whether Daniel hoped the old woman would eventually give up. She never complained. She simply kept farming. Have you ever owned something everyone else insisted you should sell, only because they couldn't understand why it mattered to you? Sometimes the value of a thing isn't written on a receipt. Sometimes it's written in every sunrise you've watched beside it, By late summer of 1979, rainfall had been generous. Corn stood tall, nearly 8 feet high in places. County agents predicted one of the strongest harvests in years, which made the timing almost unbelievable. Wild boars weren't common in Adair County. Occasionally, someone reported escaped hybrids from private game preserves in neighboring states, but an entire sounder of 63 animals appearing overnight was nearly impossible to explain. Sheriff Harold Benton arrived before noon. He studied the broken fencing along Daniel's newly purchased woodland tract, then the deep hoof prints leading directly toward Evelyn's property. "You keep boars?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "They weren't supposed to get out." 63 of them? Looks that way. Neighbors gathered along the gravel road. Some whispered. Some stared at the shredded corn. Then Daniel laughed. It wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was casual. The kind of laugh people use when they believe someone else's loss is simply the price of progress. "I guess that old place finally met something it can't outlast," he said. Several men chuckled with him. Evelyn brushed dirt from her gloves, looked toward the damaged field, then back at Daniel. Her voice stayed calm. "They're hungry," she said. "Hungry animals make predictable decisions." Daniel grinned wider. "I think your harvest finished." "No." She shook her head gently. "I think they're exactly where I need them." For the first time all morning, the laughter stopped. Even Sheriff Benton turned to look at her. Nobody asked what she meant. Nobody thought they needed to, because from where they stood, 63 wild boars were tearing through thousands of dollars worth of corn, and an elderly farmer with a 50-foot wide smile would have seemed more believable than an elderly farmer who looked completely unafraid. Evelyn climbed onto the faded John Deere, pressed the starter, and listened as the old engine came alive with familiar steady cadence. Pop, pop, pop. She pointed the tractor toward the damaged field instead of away from it, and before anyone could understand why, something deep inside the corn began moving toward her instead of away. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence, not complete silence. The old John Deere still echoed across the field with its slow, unmistakable rhythm. Pop, pop, pop. But the frantic crashing inside the corn had changed. The stalk still swayed. Leaves still shook. Only now the movement wasn't random. It was flowing, like water finding a channel. Sheriff Harold Benton narrowed his eyes. "That's odd." Daniel Mercer folded his arms again. "They're probably just running deeper into her field." Evelyn never answered. She eased a 1952 John Deere 60 into first gear, barely faster than a man could walk. Dust drifted lazily behind her rear tires as the tractor crawled toward the north fence. She wasn't chasing the boars. She was guiding them. The crowd watched without understanding. Let me tell you about wild hogs. Long before they became headline news in southern states, escaped Eurasian boars occasionally appear across parts of the Midwest after breaking out of private breeding operations. Unlike domestic hogs, wild boars move as a group when frightened, following the oldest sow almost instinctively. They avoid loud, unfamiliar noises, but they also dislike being trapped. Give them one obvious escape route, and they'll usually choose it instead of fighting. Evelyn knew that, not from books. From 40 years of raising livestock. Years earlier, her husband had once spent an entire afternoon quietly steering escaped feeder pigs through 3 open gates without touching a single one. "You don't beat animals," Thomas used to say. "You convince them." Those words stayed with her long after he was gone. The old tractor continued forward. Steady, predictable, never revving, never lunging. The boars shifted again. Rows of corn bent one after another until everyone could see a broad wave moving across the field. Sheriff Benton whispered, almost to himself, "They're turning." Daniel frowned. "They're animals. They don't turn because of a tractor." Evelyn finally spoke. "No, they turn because they believe they found an easier path." She lifted one hand slightly. Her dog, an aging border collie named Duke, trotted along the fence instead of entering the field. Even Duke understood. Never pressure from both sides. Always leave an opening. Within minutes, the first boar burst from the corn, then another, then 10 more, instead of scattering toward neighboring farms. They poured through a narrow gap between two old hedgerows where Evelyn had quietly removed a section of woven wire fence years earlier to move cattle, one after another. 63 frightened animals, all choosing the same escape, straight back toward the abandoned timber on Daniel Mercer's side of property. Daniel's smile disappeared. The sheriff looked at the fresh tracks. So they're headed back where they came from. Daniel forced a laugh. They'll wander somewhere else. Almost on cue, another dozen disappeared into his oak grove, then another dozen. By sunset, every visible animal had crossed the property line. Not one remained in Evelyn's corn. People stood speechless. The damage looked bad, but not nearly as bad as everyone expected. Most of the destruction was concentrated in only a few acres where the animals had entered before dawn. The rest of the crop still stood tall. Daniel climbed into his pickup without saying another word. For the first time all day, he looked worried. Have you ever watched someone remain completely calm while everyone around them panicked? It almost feels unnatural. Our first instinct is to fight harder, move faster, raise our voices. Yet, sometimes the person who appears to be doing the least is actually seeing the most. Evelyn understood something the rest of the crowd had forgotten. Nature follows patterns. People often don't. 3 days passed. County officials estimated Evelyn had lost roughly 9 acres of marketable corn. Serious damage, but nowhere near the disaster neighbors had predicted. Daniel wasn't so fortunate. Reports started arriving from adjoining landowners. Rooted pastures, destroyed hayfields, broken fences, fresh boar tracks everywhere. Because once the animals returned to the timber connected to Daniel's expanding property, they spread outward in every direction. The sheriff's office received complaint after complaint. Hunters volunteered. Conservation officers inspected the area. Nobody could gather all 63 animals quickly. Meanwhile, Daniel's insurance company requested paperwork, then photographs, then more inspections. His celebration had become paperwork measured by the inch. That Saturday morning, the Greenfield feed store buzzed louder than usual. Coffee cups clinked. Farm reports played softly from a radio near the counter. Daniel walked in wearing pressed jeans and polished boots. The conversation stopped. He noticed immediately. Old Frank Donnelly finally broke the silence. Looks like those hogs found their way home. A few people chuckled. Not cruelly, just enough. Daniel tried to smile. They'll be caught. Frank nodded. I'm sure they will. But that's an expensive way to learn where your fences were weak. Daniel bought his supplies quietly and left, for perhaps the first time in years. Nobody followed him outside, hoping to hear another confident speech about modern farming. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Benton stopped by Evelyn's farmhouse. She poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs older than either of them cared to admit. I suppose everybody thinks I planned it, she said. You did. I planned for animals. She smiled gently. I didn't plan for pride. The sheriff laughed. I've been thinking about that. So have I. He looked toward the old John Deere parked beneath the machine shed. You know, I almost told you to chase those hogs harder. You almost did. I'm glad you ignored me. Evelyn nodded. I've ignored plenty of people. Let me tell you about that John Deere. Thomas Harper didn't buy it because it was the biggest tractor available. He bought it because he believed dependable machinery paid for itself every harvest. The 2-cylinder engine produced a kind of pulling force farmers respected more than advertising brochures ever could. Its flywheel carried momentum through heavy loads instead of demanding high engine speed. Every grease fitting received attention every Saturday. Every bolt was checked before planting season. Thomas used a joke that if a man listened carefully enough, a tractor would tell him what it needed long before it broke. After he died, Evelyn kept listening. The machine became less like equipment, more like conversation. As September slipped toward October, another surprise appeared. The rooted patches where the Boars had torn apart the outer edge of Evelyn's fields exposed something nobody expected to find. Old clay drainage tiles. Broken ones. Collapsed ones. Some dating back before the Second World War. Most farmers would have cursed the discovery. Evelyn didn't. She climbed down from the tractor, knelt in the dirt, picked up one cracked section, and quietly smiled. Sheriff Benton, standing beside her, looked puzzled. "What is it?" She brushed soil from the clay pipe. "If these lines were blocked, then I've been farming only half this field." The sheriff stared across the damaged acres. Neither man nor woman spoke for several seconds, because if Evelyn was right, the wild boars hadn't just torn up her corn. They had uncovered something buried for decades. Sheriff Harold Benton picked up the broken length of clay tile and turned it over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked. The cracked edges were packed with roots as thick as a man's thumb, proof that water hadn't flowed to the line in years. Evelyn brushed away another layer of soil with the toe of her boot. "There'll be more," she said quietly. Daniel Mercer happened to be driving past when he saw them kneeling in the field. Curiosity overcame pride. He parked beside the road and walked over, his polished boots collecting black Iowa mud with every step. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Evelyn held up the clay pipe. "The reason this corner never yielded the way it should." Daniel frowned. "Looks like broken drain tile." "It is." "So," she smiled. "So this land has been trying to tell someone it couldn't breathe. Let me tell you about clay drainage tile. Long before modern plastic pipe became common, Midwestern farmers buried short sections of fire clay beneath wet fields. Each piece connected to the next, creating underground channels that carried excess water into creeks and ditches. During wet springs, those hidden lines could mean the difference between planting in April or waiting until June. When roots invaded or sections collapsed, water stayed trapped beneath the surface. Crops above those spots often look healthy from the road, but their roots struggled because the soil remained saturated long after every rain. People often think horsepower made American farms productive. Just as important was what happened underground. The best farmers paid attention to both. County Extension Agent Richard Owens arrived 2 days later with maps dating back to the early 1940s. He spread them across Evelyn's kitchen table. "I'll be honest," he admitted. "I didn't think these records still existed." Thin blue lines crossed the faded paper. Old drainage routes. Most of them matched exactly where the Boars had rooted. Richard adjusted his glasses. "I've never seen anything quite like this." Daniel stood silently near the doorway. For once, he wasn't offering opinions. He was listening. Evelyn traced one line with a weathered finger. "If we clear these..." Richard nodded slowly. "This entire north field could drain properly again." Daniel looked out the window toward the damaged acres. "How much difference could that make?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Depending on the season, 20, maybe 30 bushels an acre." The room fell quiet. On 80 acres, that wasn't just an improvement. It was a transformation. Have you ever discovered that your biggest setback had uncovered the answer to a problem you didn't even know you had? Most people spend years trying to erase the evidence of hardship. Sometimes it's worth asking what that hardship revealed before you bury it again. Repairs began the following Monday. Neighbors arrived with shovels. One brought an old trenching machine. Another loaned a backhoe. No one asked for payment. They simply started working. Even Daniel Mercer showed up before sunrise. At first, nobody knew what to make of it. He climbed from his pickup, carrying a toolbox. "I figured you could use another pair of hands." Evelyn looked at him for several long seconds, then nodded toward the ditch. "There's room." Nothing more, nothing less. The work lasted nearly 3 weeks. Broken clay sections came out. New drainage pipe went in. Every few hundred feet, they uncovered another collapse line that had likely been buried since the Eisenhower administration. Daniel worked harder than anyone expected. He shoveled mud, carried pipe, ran the trencher, sometimes in complete silence. Old Frank, Donnelly noticed, looks different without all the talking. Sheriff Benton smiled. Sometimes life does the talking for you. One afternoon, Daniel paused beside the John Deere 60. The tractor sat beneath the machine shed while workers ate lunch. He ran a hand across the faded hood. "I used to think this thing belonged in a museum." Evelyn poured coffee into enamel cups. "And now, I think I was measuring the wrong things." She handed him a cup. "This tractor never cared what people thought." Daniel laughed softly. "No, I suppose it didn't." The harvest arrived in late October. Golden rows stretched toward the horizon beneath clear blue skies. Combines rolled across neighboring farms. Grain trucks lined county roads. Everyone expected Evelyn's yields to recover next year. No one expected much from the repaired acres this season. After all, the Boars had destroyed part of the crop. The drainage repairs had interrupted even more. Richard Owens insisted on measuring everything carefully. The combine emptied its first hopper. Then another. Numbers appeared on the monitor. Richard checked them twice. Then a third time. That can't be right. Daniel stepped closer. What is it? 87 bushels. That's impossible. Richard shook his head. Not impossible. That's just the first pass. By late afternoon, something remarkable became clear. The repaired sections of field were consistently outperforming neighboring ground that had looked healthier all summer. Not by a little. By enough to surprise everyone present. The deeper root systems had taken advantage of late-season moisture once excess water finally drained away. Years of hidden problems had been holding the soil back. The Boars had exposed them. The repairs had solved them. Daniel stared across the field as grain poured into waiting wagons. I celebrated too early, he said quietly. Evelyn looked toward the old John Deere resting near the edge of the field. No, you learned. There is a difference. Daniel nodded. I think there is. As the sun settled low over Adair County, Sheriff Benton removed his hat and watched the final wagon head toward the grain elevator. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The numbers already had. But before the last acre could be harvested, a county official sedan turned onto the gravel road, carrying news that would change both neighboring farms in a way neither Evelyn nor Daniel had imagined. The county sedan rolled to a stop beside the machine shed just as the last wagon of corn pulled away from the field. Out stepped Marion Keller, an agricultural conservation officer from the Iowa Department of Agriculture. She carried a leather folder thick with maps, survey notes, and photographs. I hope I'm not interrupting your harvest, she said. Evelyn smiled. Harvest always ends. Good news shouldn't wait. Marion unfolded an aerial photograph taken only weeks earlier after heavy autumn rain. The repaired drainage lines beneath Evelyn's north field stood out clearly. Water had moved exactly as the original engineers intended nearly 40 years before. Even more surprising, the restoration had reduced runoff into a nearby creek, helping prevent erosion on neighboring properties. Marion looked at both farmers. What happened here is exactly what we've been encouraging. Daniel exchanged a glance with Evelyn. We didn't exactly plan it. Marion smiled. The best lessons usually aren't planned. Within months, Adair County began using photographs of the restored drainage project during local agricultural meetings. Farmers from neighboring counties came to see the repaired fields for themselves. They expected to hear about engineering. Instead, they heard about patience. A week later, Daniel Mercer drove to Evelyn's farmhouse carrying a folded envelope. There were no reporters, no neighbors, no audience, just two farmers standing on an old wooden porch as the November wind rattled the cottonwoods. Daniel handed her the envelope. I owe you an apology. Evelyn didn't open it. You don't owe me paper. I owe you more than paper. He looked down at his boots before continuing. I laughed. I remember. I thought bigger meant better. She nodded. It often does. He looked surprised. But not always. Evelyn rested it against the porch railing. The mistake wasn't buying modern equipment. Daniel frowned. It wasn't. No. The mistake was believing old experience had nothing left to teach. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel smiled. The Boars taught me. Evelyn chuckled softly. They were expensive teachers. Let me tell you about something people rarely measure. Not horsepower, not acreage, not grain prices. Humility. You cannot buy it at an auction. You cannot finance it through a bank. Most people earn it only after life presents them with undeniable evidence that confidence and wisdom are not the same thing. Daniel Mercer learned that lesson in a single harvest. It took some people an entire lifetime. The old 1952 John Deere 60 never became a museum piece. Every spring, Evelyn rolled out a machine shed. checked every grease fitting, topped off the fluids, and listened to the familiar rhythm. Pop, pop, pop. Young mechanics often offered to restore it with shiny paint and polished chrome. She always thanked them, then politely declined. The scratches belong there, she would say. So do the faded places. Every mark had been earned. Every dent carried someone's memory. The machine wasn't beautiful because it looked new. It was beautiful because it still worked. 5 years passed. Then 10. Daniel expanded his operation again, but differently this time. Before buying neighboring ground, he walked every field with the families who had farmed it. He asked questions instead of giving answers. He hired older retired farmers as seasonal consultants, believing experience deserved a place beside technology. Some younger operators laughed at the idea. Daniel never argued. He simply smiled. He had learned where laughter could lead. Sheriff Harold Benton retired in 1988 after nearly 3 decades of service. Whenever reporters asked him about the strangest call of his career, they expected stories about storms or escaped cattle. Instead, he always mentioned 63 wild boars, not because of the animals, because of what they uncovered beneath the soil. Have you ever looked back on the worst day of your life and realized it quietly changed everything that followed? At the time, hardship rarely introduces itself as opportunity. It usually arrives looking exactly like loss. Only years later do we understand that some doors open only after another has been forced shut. In the spring of 1992, Evelyn Harper planted her final crop. She was 84. Her hands shook a little more than they once had. Climbing onto the John Deere took longer, but once she settled into the worn metal seat, everything felt familiar. The steering wheel, the clutch, the sound. Fields remember people. Machines do too. That autumn, she gathered her family beneath the machine shed. Her granddaughter Claire, 26 years old, and recently graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in agronomy, stood beside the old tractor. Evelyn placed the ignition key into her hand. "This farm isn't yours because I'm giving it to you," she said. "It's yours because you've already been taking care of it." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I'll keep it running." "I know." She wasn't talking only about the tractor. Evelyn Harper passed away peacefully in her sleep during January 1995. The funeral filled the small country church beyond expectation. Farmers arrived driving pickups covered in winter salt. Bankers came. County officials came. So did Daniel Mercer. When the service ended, he remained standing beside the old John Deere for several quiet minutes. Claire eventually walked over. "He always said you taught him more than anyone." Daniel smiled gently. She never tried to. Years later, visitors driving the gravel roads of Adair County sometimes noticed an old red tractor working slowly through a field that larger machines could have finished much faster. Some wondered why anyone still used it. The locals already knew. It wasn't about efficiency. It never had been. It was about remembering that every harvest is built upon the work of people who came before, people whose names gradually disappear from records but remain alive in the habits they leave behind. The repaired drainage lines still carried spring water away from those fields. The corn still grew. The machine still started. And Daniel Mercer, now gray-haired himself, never laughed when he saw old equipment working another season. Instead, he tipped his cap because he finally understood. Some victories arrive with applause. The most important ones arrive quietly, one steady engine stroke at a time. Some things aren't made valuable by surviving the years. They become valuable because they teach every generation how to face them. If this story reminded you of someone who stayed calm when everyone else doubted them, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or an old friend who never needed to raise their voice to earn respect. Those stories deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who rescued a rusted steam engine from a creek after 20 years underwater and discovered it could still change a family's future, that's a story I'll be sharing next. I hope you'll be here when it's time to tell it.